Okay, good afternoon. I am Agresti, and as Fabio said, today I'm going to talk about machine learning techniques and machine learning techniques applied to the boson sampling validation problem, and more specifically about unsupervised machine learning techniques. Since Fabio gave a talk a few minutes ago and gave a detailed explanation about boson sampling and its validation, I'm going to be very brief with my introduction, and I will recall just a few concepts to understand better, to better understand my presentation. And what we want to do with boson sampling is to answer to the question if a quantum hardware can bring, in principle, some advantage over a classical hardware. So basically, can we, in principle, reach quantum supremacy? And quantum supremacy is the regime in which we can show a quantum advantage. Quantum supremacy has been gaining a lot of interest in recent years. As it can be shown, it can be seen by the review which was published by Nature last year about quantum computational supremacy. And the answer to this question before the 90s was given only by the extended Church-Turing thesis, which states that a probabilistic Turing machine, which means a classical computer, can efficiently simulate any realistic model of computation. This means that no hardware, no quantum hardware can bring any advantage over a classical platform. And by efficient solution of a problem, we mean that the resources that are required to solve the problem scale at most polynomially with the input size of the problem. So in the 90s, there was the Shor proposed this algorithm for the factorization of large integers, but it's very hard to implement that algorithm on a quantum hardware. So in 2010, Aronson and Arkhipov proposed boson sampling, which in turn is very hard task, way harder than factorization, but which seems to be easily implementable in laboratory. So as Fabio said, boson sampling consists in sampling from the output probability of n bosons injected through a linear interferometer, indistinguishable bosons. And if we want to solve this problem classically, like Fabio said, we should go either for the brute force approach. So we evaluate the whole probability distribution and then sample, which is unfeasible because when we grow the input size of the problem, which is the number of bosons and the number of modes, the number of possible configurations grows exponentially. And the other thing is that to evaluate the whole probability distribution, we have to evaluate permanence, which is a problem, very complicated, but very hard problem, which belongs to the sharp P class of complexity. Recently, Anthony's group proposed another method to approach boson sampling classically. And they exploited Monte Carlo methods. They exploited rejection sampling and the Markov chain Monte Carlo independent sampler. And so they were able to raise the limit beyond which we can talk about quantum advantage. So if we go on quantum hardware, the situation is very better because we only have to prepare the bosonic state. For example, in Rome, we use a photonic platform, so we have to prepare the photonic state. We use SPDC sources. We have to implement the unitary operator, which we do, for example, with integrated photonics in collaboration with the Polytechnic of Milan. And then we have to sample from the output distribution. So the situation seems better. It seems that we have solved the problem because we have found a task which is hard, and it seems that we can implement it on a quantum hardware, so everything seems fine. But here there is the complication of how can we be sure that our device is working properly. And so, as Fabio said, this is not a trivial problem, because when we raise the number of photons and the number of modes, we don't have a theoretical model, because we can't evaluate the whole probability distribution. When we perform our measurements, we cover only a limited space of the Hilbert space, so we can't even know from which distribution we are sampling from. And even if we had infinite measurements and we could reconstruct the whole distribution perfectly, we couldn't check whether it's correct or not, because permanent is hard to verify. So it seems that we have a problem. And this opens the way to the field of boson sampling validation. So boson sampling validation aims to rule out alternative hypotheses. For example, one of the most important alternative hypotheses, is that we inject distinguishable bosons instead of indistinguishable, and in this way we wouldn't have quantum interference. There are many algorithms, of course, have been proposed to validate boson samplers. And many of them rely on permanent computation evaluation. So they are not scalable because, as I said, permanents are hard to evaluate. So in our work, we approach a slightly different problem. So we assume that we have a validated device, and we want to validate another device, but without evaluating permanence. We want to rely only on experimental data. So what we do is, at first, we draw two samples, one from the device we want to validate, and the other one from the device we already have validated. And we represent each output event, so each configuration event that we sampled, as a vector, an m-dimensional vector. So if we have a 4 input and output interferometer, we will have 4-dimensional vectors. And for each mode, we will represent the configurations, putting for each mode the number of photons that are in that mode. So for example, if I have 2 photons that exit the interferometer from the first and the fourth mode, the state would be 1001. And so we take an m-dimensional geometrical space and put these events that we sampled inside this geometrical space. So the coordinates are the occupational numbers of our states. And we exploit Euclidean distance to evaluate the distance from between 2 points. Then we forget about one sample, and we take one of them, and we build a cluster structure on the sample. And this is where machine learning comes in, as we will see in a few moments. So we build a cluster structure, we will see how. And then we keep the structure fixed and put the events from the other sample inside the already built structure. In the end, we perform a compatibility test, a chi-square test, where we compare the number of events for each cluster belonging to the first sample and to the second one. And if the compatibility test says that they are compatible, we have validated the device. Otherwise, we have not. So for the clustering, for the building of our cluster structure, we adopted several unsupervised machine learning techniques, and the best results were obtained adopting the k-means clustering, which is a very well-known technique, and I'll recall it briefly. So in k-means clustering, we have to choose the number of clusters that we want to build. Then we have to initialize the centroids, which can be done randomly or with more sophisticated techniques like k-means plus plus and so on. Then every element is assigned to the cluster whose centroid is the nearest. And then the centroids are updated to the mean of the coordinates of each event in the cluster. So then step 3 and step 4 are iterated until there is no change in the cluster structure from one step to the other. So when the structure is stable, we have our structure. So what we did was that we trained our algorithm to tune the hyperparameters that were free. So the only hyperparameters that we had in this case were the sample size and the number of clusters. So for example, we kept fixed the number of the sample size, and we changed the number of clusters, and we saw the success percentage of the algorithm. And we tested both success percentage when the algorithm was comparing compatible samples, and both when it was comparing uncompatible samples, which were samples from the boson sampling distribution and from the distinguishable input distribution. And we trained our algorithm both with experimental and numerical data. In the left plot, we have the purple dots are where compatible samples are compared, the orange when uncompatible samples are compared. And in the other plot, there is only the case in which uncompatible samples were compared, because the other one was 100% heavy. So it was not useful to see. So when once we had trained the algorithm, we tried if the algorithm was able to deal with alternative hypotheses which were not used during the training. So we tested the mean field sampler and the uniform sampler also. And we raised the Hilbert space dimension. Of course, for higher Hilbert spaces dimension, we adopted only numerical data. And we saw that the performance of the algorithm was still good. And so after seeing these results, we asked ourselves, why is it working? So why this algorithm, this clustering algorithm works? And we tried two different, we investigated two different research guides. So at first, we went to see if the probability distribution given by the boson sampling distribution and given by the distinguishable input distribution were correlated in some way. So what we did was we took a random unitary matrix for the case of 4 photons and 40 modes, and 5 photons and 50 modes on the right. And we sorted the probabilities of the boson sampling distribution in a decreasing order, as you can see in the upper part. And then on the bottom part, we plotted the probabilities given by the distinguishable input distribution for the same sequence of configurations. And so we can see that there is no evident, I mean, the probability on the bottom part seems random. They are not decreasing or increasing. So we can see that they are uncorrelated. The two distributions are uncorrelated. And then we went to see how the configurations, the configurations with the highest probability were if they were near to each other or far apart for the two distributions. So what we did was we took the boson sampling distribution for photons and 40 modes, and we tried 100 different unitary matrices. And we took the event, the configuration with the highest probability, and then went to see what was the sum of the probabilities of all the configurations within a given radius from the first event. And we evaluated that quantity, which is the probability, the sum of the probabilities given for the boson sampling distribution and the sum of the probabilities given for the same configurations in the distinguishable input case. So if that quantity is more than 1, let's say, it means that the events with the highest probabilities are near to each other, and when we instead, okay, they are near to each other, while if we consider the same events but with the probabilities of the distinguishable input distribution, they have not high probabilities. So this means in practice that the clustering algorithm can recognize this internal structure of the probability distribution, because we can see that the blue histograms plot the R values we evaluated, and the R value is over 1. So this means that the most likely configurations are near to each other. We did the same thing, but starting with the distinguishable input case, and also in that case, the events are together, but they are not the same events. So, the clustering algorithm can recognize this internal structure. So in the end, this was the first application of machine learning techniques to the problem of boson sampling validation. And we think that it brought encouraging results because, as I said, it doesn't require any permanent evaluation. And this algorithm has proved to be this algorithm is effective also when we try alternative hypotheses which were not used during the training. And they can deal also with the larger Hilbert space. So it shows, the algorithm shows good scalability. So we think it may be worth to investigate, this matter can be investigated in the future. So thank you for your attention. And this is the archive link for the paper. So thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. Questions? Well, I have one. So the machine learning methods that you use here are all shallow techniques, right? So whatever you tried, k-means or random forest, yes, or any unsupervised method that are shallow techniques, which have the great advantage of being cheap, computationally cheap. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you looked at any kind of like Bayesian extension to these methods, so you would get some confidence intervals or any kind of probabilistic guarantee that your result is correct.
Yeah, we're okay. We started with these techniques, which are very famous, because we wanted to see if it was a direction worth following. Now we are trying to go on to go farther, and for example, we are thinking to apply neural networks to this problem, and so we are. It's a work in progress, but yeah, this was only this work was only to start to investigate in this direction. So yes.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Yeah, Desmond.
Is basically in the line of Peter's question, because you mentioned that the best results were achieved by k-means, right? Which other clustering algorithms did you use?
What other?
Which other clustering algorithms?
We adopted, for example, a hierarchical clustering, yeah, we also tried. There was another proposal by Wang and Duan, which they tried another clustering technique, what they made up, which was which relied on the the events with the highest probabilities. So they took as a centroids the events with the highest probabilities, and then assigned every element to the cluster whose centroid was the nearest. So we tried basically these three were the most investigated, these three techniques. But as I said, k-means showed the best results, and we tried also different initialization of the centroids. For example, we tried the k-means plus plus, and then we tried also to combine the techniques. So for example, we tried to apply hierarchical clustering, and then take the centroids of the hierarchical clustering as the input of k-means clustering. So we investigated many directions. But, yeah.
Okay, more questions? Well, if not, then let's thank the speaker again.